Hello, and welcome to Western Civ, episode 267, Copernicus, Part 4. By comparing Copernicus to Regiomontanus and Ptolemy, Rheticus conveyed that he was greatly impressed with Copernicus's work. In the pages of Copernicus's manuscript, Rheticus observed the manifestation of a brilliant mind, and a man who was also patient, diligent, and respectful of the great astronomers who had preceded him. It was a long work. The English translation is about 400 book pages, composed of lengthy tables with data on the motions of the heavenly bodies, numerous geometric diagrams, page upon page of trigonometric and algebraic expressions, instructions on how to build and use astronomical instruments, and of course, a description of his new model of the heavens. Rheticus wrote, quote, "But from the time that I became, by God's will, a spectator and witness of the labors which my teacher performs with an energetic mind and has in large measure already accomplished, I realized that I had not dreamed of even the shadow of so great a burden of work, and it is so great a labor that it is not any hero who can endure it and finally complete it." End quote. The manuscript is divided into 6 parts. The first was a, quote, "general description of the universe," end quote. The outline of the sun-centered universe was presented in this early section. The second explored the, quote, "doctrine of the first motion," end quote, a term used to describe the perceived motion of the fixed stars, the specks of light in the night sky that always remained their position in relation to the heavenly bodies. The third book focused on the sun, the fourth the moon and lunar eclipses, the fifth the motions of the other planets, and the sixth discussed the celestial latitudes of the planets. From everything that transpired over the next several months, 2 developments must have occurred. First, Rheticus quickly realized that the manuscript that he was reading was extraordinary in its originality and ambition, and he told Copernicus of this. Second, Rheticus asked Copernicus if he could write a manuscript that attempted to summarize and explain what was in the several major sections of the work. Copernicus agreed. Over the next 16 weeks, from late May to late September, Rheticus read and absorbed most of the complicated manuscript, conferred with Copernicus often, and then wrote a refined and polished manuscript containing his own summary of Copernicus's heliocentric system. The resulting book, entitled Narratio Prima, which means the first report, was to introduce the world to this new heliocentric theory. In the pages of the Narratio Prima, and in a preface to the book that he wrote a little over a decade later, Rheticus provided several fascinating glimpses of how Copernicus worked, how the 2 astronomers interacted with each other, what they talked about during these watershed months, how Rheticus himself worked, and what he did during his months in Warmia. The portrait of Copernicus and the buoyant tone of the Narratio show that both men were enthralled to be engaged with one another. Outside of Copernicus's house, the atmosphere was growing increasingly difficult for both men. Rheticus was a Lutheran, and now openly defying Bishop Danticus's recent order to leave Warmia. Copernicus was still dealing with the Anna Schilling affair. But within the safe walls of Copernicus's house, the 2 men could push away all that and focus on what had brought them together, a mutual love of astronomy. Rheticus left us this description in the Narratio Prima of the 2 men working together. "I remember myself being driven by juvenile curiosity. I wished to hasten to the star sanctuary. So, agreeing with the very good and great man Copernicus, I sometimes blamed the painstaking attention to detail. But he was bewildered by my soul's honest thirst, and with a soft arm he used to exhort me to take my hand off the tables. Personally, he said, if I could get the truth from a 6th part which an increment of 10 minutes, my spirit would exult as much as when received by the discovery of the formula and the ratios by Pythagoras." Rheticus continued, "He wanted his researchers to be above average. That's why he avoided grindings, not by inertia nor by fear of boredom. Some people seek and even require those little gains, like Purbach and the subtlety of his tables of eclipses. They can see them with all the care taken to locate the stars with precision. While they are impressed by the seconds, thirds, fourths, fifths, and little divisions, they forget the integer parts, not giving them a single look. And in the small interval times of the phenomena, they often are wrong by hours and sometimes entire days. There's an amazing fable of Aesop, where an order is given to search for a lost cow. It is found, but the men who are to bring it back see little birds and go after them, forgetting the cow. End quote. Essentially, what Rheticus is saying here is that Copernicus has a great ability to see not just the trees but the forest, to see the big picture and how all of the different component parts fit together, whereas previous astronomers had focused solely on creating minute tables. To an extent, this is true, but to an extent, Copernicus was also taking advantage of the painstaking labor that had been done by other men before him. In mid-July, Rheticus and Copernicus traveled to the nearby castle of Luba at the invitation of Copernicus's best friend, Tiedemann Gies. There, Gies managed to provide Copernicus with a bit of rest and relaxation. Both men needed it. Rheticus had been ill since spring, but in Luba he recovered. Even the recovery and relaxation was not going to impair the fruitful period. Gies had urged the two men to journey to Luba so that he could revisit the topic that Copernicus had waved off many times in the past, the publication of his astronomical manuscript. With Rheticus there to support him, perhaps Gies's plea would be heard. In probably the single most meaningful scientific exchange found in Copernicus's sources, Rheticus recorded a discussion between Copernicus and Gies about how to publish his important work. It's difficult to discern whether Rheticus witnessed a single discussion or whether his account was a conflation of years' worth of prodding by Gies. Chances are Rheticus observed at least one discussion in which all the issues were aired, but it surely was not the first time that such a discussion had taken place. In the Narratio Prima, Rheticus writes, quote, "He, Gies, realized that it would be of no small importance to the glory of Christ if there existed a proper calendar of events in a church and a correct theory and explanation of the motions. He did not cease urging my teacher, whose accomplishments and insight he had known for many years, to take up the problem until he persuaded him to do so. Since my teacher saw the scientific world also stood in need of improvement of the motions, he readily yielded to the entreaties of his friend. He promised that he would draw up astronomical tables with new rules, and that if his work had any value, he would not keep it from the world." End quote. Toward the end of summer, Rheticus and Copernicus left Luba for home. The two reached Fromborg on or about September the 23rd, 1539. By then, Rheticus at least was ready to publish. His work, Narratio Prima, was effectively an overview of his time spent with Copernicus. To this day, it remains the best primer on Copernican heliocentrism. In this book, Rheticus is careful to compliment Ptolemy, Aristotle, and the ancients. He never describes Copernicus as a revolutionary and makes numerous references to God throughout his work. The Narratio Prima is a summary of Copernicus's manuscript, but it does not address heliocentrism and the moving Earth theory immediately. Then, about 1/4 of the way into the Narratio Prima, Rheticus finally begins to discuss and highlight Copernicus's work. He reluctantly states that Ptolemy's model cannot explain the movements of celestial bodies in a consistent way. So, quote, "It was therefore necessary for my teacher, Copernicus, to devise a new hypothesis." End quote. A few pages later, the heliocentric theory is revealed for the first time ever in a printed book. Quote, "The planets are each year observed as direct, stationary, retrograde, near to, and remote from the Earth, etc. These phenomena, besides being ascribed to the planets, can be explained, as my teacher shows, by a regular motion of the spherical Earth, that is, by having the Sun occupy the center of the universe, while the Earth revolves, instead of the Sun on the eccentric, which it has pleased him to name the Great Circle. Indeed, there is something divine in the circumstance that a sure understanding of celestial phenomenon must depend on the regular and uniform motion of the terrestrial globe alone." End quote. Rheticus goes on to discuss the second stunner in Copernicus's model. The Earth, like the ball on a lathe, rotates from west to east as God's will ordains, and by this motion, the terrestrial globe produces day and night. In mid-February 1540, a batch of the preliminary pages of the Narratio made their way to Wittenberg and the desk of Melanchthon. He was clearly captivated. After a lengthy comment on Rheticus's passage in his book about the second coming of Christ and the determining of the price age of the earth, Melanchthon says, quote, "Yet enough of this, of that above, just as I ask you again and again that you offer me your friendship, I ask that you apply yourself diligently and win over the friendship of that man Copernicus for me as well. I don't risk writing him at the present, and although I didn't intend to, you will certainly keep my triflings from him." End quote. Then, in August of that year, Johannes Petreius, the Nuremberg publisher, did something strange. He dedicated a book to Rheticus in the form of a letter, and in that letter he boldly asks Rheticus to convince Copernicus to publish his long-awaited book and publish it with him, Petreius, in Nuremberg. After congratulating Rheticus on the Narratio, calling it splendid, he states that, quote, "I consider it a glorious treasure if someday, through your urging, his observations will be imparted to us," end quote. Petreius hoped that Rheticus would see the dedication as a kind of reward. Then, to close the deal, Petreius finishes his letter by reminding Rheticus how Nuremberg is a major trading hub, that his publishing company is able to distribute books to every corner of Europe, and that Schooner, the scholar who had taken such good care of Rheticus during his stay and had taught him much, also wants to see Copernicus published in Nuremberg. Quote, "It will fall on you not only to commend our service, but also to acknowledge and proclaim the great favor of Schooner toward you," end quote. With this level of support, Copernicus finally caved. He would publish On the Heavenly Bodies. He would publish his entire manuscript. This was hundreds of pages long. So over the next year, Copernicus painstakingly revised and updated his massive work. Rheticus was there to help him, but Copernicus did the vast majority of the work himself. Quick aside, in late 1540, Rheticus returned to Wittenberg to teach an introduction to astronomy, but he quickly returned to Fromborg to help with the manuscript. As another aside, incredibly, we still have Copernicus's original manuscript, by the way. Somehow, some way, it survived nearly 5 centuries. In late summer 1541, Copernicus finished his task. His monumental work was done. From here on out, its publication would be the responsibility of others. Rheticus could not miss another semester at the University of Wittenberg. So in late September 1541, he said goodbye to Copernicus and began his journey back to the university. Rheticus had spent over 2 years in Warmia, and before that 8 months in the Nuremberg area. Except for his brief return to the University of Wittenberg in the winter of 1540-1541, he had been away from his home university for almost 3 years. Rheticus should have returned as a conquering hero, the author of a much talked about book, and the lone disciple of a visionary astronomer. And he possessed the most acclaimed unpublished manuscript in all of Europe. His reception in Wittenberg, though, was mixed. Back in June 1539, just as Rheticus had arrived in Fromberg, Luther had said at one of his dinner seminars, quote, "There is mention of a new astrologer who wanted to prove that the earth moves and not the sky, the sun and the moon. This would be as if somebody were riding on a cart or in a ship and imagined that he was standing still while the earth and trees were moving. So it goes now. Whoever wants to be clever must agree with nothing that others esteem. I believe the Holy Scriptures, for Joshua commanded the sun to stand still and not the earth," end quote. Despite Luther's criticisms, most of the university was happy to have Rheticus back. They had all read the Narratio Primia and realized that he was leaps and bounds ahead of anyone else in the field. In fact, immediately upon his return, Rheticus found himself elected the new dean of faculty. When the spring semester ended, Rheticus, Copernicus's manuscript in tow headed south to Nuremberg. He gave Petraeus the manuscript, and the printer immediately set himself to work. At this point, the only portions of the book that needed finishing were the preface and the introduction. Now, of course, printing books took a long time in the 16th century, and Rheticus had to get back to Wittenberg before the job was done. Before Rheticus left, he and Petraeus decided that the book still needed an expert overseer. The person asked to assume this role was nonetheless Andreas Osiander, the theologian and philosopher who had come to know Rheticus back in 1538, and who had taken such an intense interest in Copernicus and his theory once he read the Narratio. He had written or edited 5 books with Petraeus since 1540, so he was also just the logical choice for kind of an editor. Recall that Osiander had corresponded with Copernicus in 1541, and that Copernicus had specifically asked for his suggestion as to how to minimize the uproar that might await his book. Osiander had answered that one way might be to present the underlying theory in the book as a mere hypothesis, and essentially say to the reader, don't worry much about the theory, it's just kind of the results that matter. Copernicus rejected this idea, but Osiander had always held strong to his opinion. It seems to have been in his character. He was unbelievably stubborn in his beliefs, especially his theological beliefs. And he had actually burned so many bridges by this time in Nuremberg that he was effectively neutralized. He was certain, like a statement, like the one that he endorsed, that he believed should begin Copernicus's book. So Osiander took advantage of his new position and essentially, secretly, slipped in a page. On this page, he put the correction that he wanted to all along. He wanted to explain that this was a hypothesis and not necessarily a theory. The problem with it was Osiander decided to do this anonymously. So when you read On the Revolutions of the Heavenly Bodies and you look at this first page, if you read it nowadays, it's been corrected. I checked, it says Osiander on there. But if you look at the original, it looks like Copernicus wrote the first page. So it looks like it's these authors' assertion, which of course it isn't. So it's extremely, extremely misleading and something definitely that Osiander should not have done. Moreover, Osiander went on to make all kinds of other assertions in this preface. He wrote, quote, "For this art, astronomy, is completely and absolutely ignorant of the causes of the apparent non-uniform motions. And if any causes are devised by the imagination, as indeed very many are, they are not put forward to convince anyone that they are true, but merely to provide a reliable basis for computation. Therefore, alongside the ancient hypotheses, which are no more probable, let us permit these new hypotheses also become known. So far as hypotheses are concerned, let no one expect anything certain from astronomy, which cannot furnish it, lest he accept as the truth ideas conceived for another purpose." End quote. So, essentially, what he's doing here is almost arguing that astronomy isn't a science, which is, again, terribly misleading and something that Copernicus never would have agreed to in a million years. And it's going to have really negative consequences, unfortunately, for the book going forward. It really is a shame for Rheticus and Copernicus that their work is essentially spoiled by Osiander at the last moment. And even worse, disaster struck on December the 8th, 1542. On that day, Copernicus, back in Frombork, suffered a debilitating stroke. He survived, but he would be crippled for the rest of his short life, and he would be in no position to defend his life work or to make corrections based off of Osiander's mistakes. The long-awaited manuscript finally rolled off the press at the end of March 1543. Few involved with the work enjoyed its publication. Gies was furious about the anonymous preface. He wrote to the Nuremberg town council demanding that Petraeus be punished for publishing it like that, even though it's actually pretty clear that Petraeus didn't know that Osiander had slipped this in. He likely thought it was supposed to have been included. Didn't matter. Gies also demanded that Petraeus issue a reprint taking the preface out. Now, Petraeus ultimately didn't suffer any consequences, but he was deeply embarrassed by the whole affair. Rheticus was also upset when he opened his copy. Copernicus left numerous thank yous in the acknowledgments section, but he didn't mention Rheticus at all. And neither did the book's author get to enjoy its publication. As it was finished, he lay dying in Frombork. On the Revolutions consists of 6 books. The books are composed of many short chapters. The work itself is carefully organized, and Copernicus took pains to provide good transitions, introductions, conclusions, and passages meant to help the reader know what has already been covered and what is coming next. But the book is, I suppose, rather unapologetically technical. There's pages upon pages of math and computations, complicated drawings, and dense tables of numbers. Book 1 is a general introduction to the model. Copernicus first discusses the importance of astronomy, and then he begins his presentation. The universe is a sphere, as is the Earth. The movements of the celestial bodies are regular and circular, and the Earth, too, has a circular motion. All of the heavenly bodies move with uniform speed, which is a critical component of his model. Very early in the book, no more than 20 pages in, he describes the, quote, movement of the Earth, end quote. That is, that our planet rotates once every 24 hours, that it revolves around the sun once every 365 days. Book 2 discusses the rotation of the Earth itself and the angle of inclination of the axis. Within this section, the author describes how to construct an astrolabe, which is used to examine the position of the moons and stars. Copernicus points out that the Earth's rotation and the revolution are slow and natural, and that's why the planet doesn't break apart and the atmosphere does not blow away. Book 3 addresses the movement of the Earth around the sun. The remaining 3 books describe the movement of the moon and of the other planets. There was no doubt that Nicholas Copernicus's book was a remarkable achievement. That much was obvious to just about every reader. But because of its complexity, not much else was. Most interested readers would need some help to understand its implications. But Copernicus would not be the one to give the clarification. On May the 24th, 1543, he died, most likely due to a hemorrhage and the subsequent paralysis of his right side. The father of modern astronomy was buried inside the Frombork Cathedral near the main altar. Except for Rheticus, most of those who played a major role in the creation of the manuscript died soon after its publication. Martin Luther died in 1546. Johann Schooner died in 1547. And Bishop Danticus in 1548. It was up to Rheticus to direct the Copernican revolution. Flash forward to the fall of 1542. Rheticus was about to begin his new position at the University of Leipzig, when they would pay him significantly more than other professors there, and much more than he had been paid by the University of Wittenberg. He was a celebrity among astronomers, thanks to his writing of the Narratio Prima and his well-known role in the preparation of On the Revolutions. He was only 28 years old, and he had impressed the finest publisher in Nuremberg, the top astrologer, and one of the leading theologians. There must have been days when he pinched himself over all that had transpired since his first visit to Nuremberg in the fall of 1538, just 4 years earlier. And there was every reason to suppose that this was just the beginning of a brilliant career. The publication of On the Revolutions of the Heavenly Bodies would send shockwaves throughout Europe, and with Copernicus in failing health, Rheticus would be the leader of the Copernican revolution. Rheticus could be the next Regiomontanus. And then, nothing. It didn't happen. Although he lived another 32 years and had several moments of acclaim, he never came close to equaling the astounding 4 years between 1538 and 1542. Rheticus died of pneumonia on December the 4th, 1574. He was never able to recapture those few glorious years working at Copernicus's side. 22 years later, Rheticus's work, Opus Palentium de Triangulus, was published, providing Europeans with the most up-to-date trigonometric tables. Sadly, Rheticus never lived to see people use them. The scholar most responsible for the immediate positive impact on the revolutions was a man by the name of Erasmus Reinhold. Reinhold was also a professor at the University of Wittenberg. Reinhold gave Europeans what they wanted, a practical way to use Copernicus's work. He published a series of astronomical tables based on Copernicus's On Revolutions in 1551. Yet, just as Regiomontanus left behind no equally talented heir, neither did Copernicus. Europeans would need to wait. They would need to wait for Tycho Brahe and for Galileo. Now, originally, I was going to go straight to Galileo. But after hemming and hawing over the last 2 months or so, I decided I simply can't skip Tycho Brahe. And so next week, we're going to cover him and then jump straight into Galileo from there. In the interim, if you'd like any additional content, check out the links in the show notes. Got the website there, got the Patreon there, got the Western Sid podcast there, 2.0 with its free trial. It's all there. If you're interested, check it out.